The coffee shop was full, the kind of polished downtown spot where no one made eye contact, and everyone pretended to be busy. Caroline Hayes stood behind a man at the register, ordinary-looking quiet, wearing a jacket that had seen better days. His card declined. The machine blinked. He tried again. Caroline's voice cut through the entire room before anyone could look away. Some people really shouldn't be in places they can't afford. The room went still. No one moved. Then Ryan, standing just behind Caroline's shoulder, saw the scar running along the man's forearm, and the color drained from his face. Caroline Hayes did not wait for things. That was the first thing anyone who worked with her learned, usually within the first week, sometimes within the first hour. She moved through the world as if the world had already agreed to get out of her way, and for the most part it did. At 38, she ran Hayes Global with the kind of authority that made board members lower their voices when she walked into a room. She had built that reputation deliberately carefully, over 15 years of decisions that most people would have been too cautious to make. She was not most people, and she made sure everyone around her understood that. That Tuesday morning, she had a meeting at 9. It was not a meeting she could reschedule. 3 senior partners from a firm that Hayes Global had been courting for over a year were flying in, and the entire agenda had been structured around her presence. She had reviewed the materials the night before, made her notes, and planned to arrive 20 minutes early. That was how she operated. Margins existed to be controlled, not consumed. So when Ryan pulled the car up outside the coffee shop at 7:45, and she decided to stop just for a coffee, just for 5 minutes, it felt like a reasonable decision. It was not. The shop was called Meridian. It was the kind of place that charged $9 for a single cup and decorated its walls with framed photographs of coffee farms in countries most of its customers had never visited. Caroline had been there twice before. She liked the espresso and the fact that the staff moved quickly. She walked in, got in line, and checked her phone. There were 4 new emails. She answered 3 of them before she even reached the counter. The man in front of her had been there when she arrived. He was ordering something simple, a medium coffee black, and he had already been at the register for what felt to Caroline like an unreasonable amount of time. She noticed his jacket first. It was clean, but worn at the cuffs, the kind of thing a person wore because it still worked, not because it was new. His shoes were practical rather than expensive. He carried no bag, no briefcase, nothing that suggested he was on his way somewhere that required him to look a certain way. His name was Jack Sullivan. He was 40 years old, and he had been awake since 5 in the morning because the overnight shift at the warehouse where he worked 3 days a week ended at 4:30. He had stopped at Meridian, not because it was his usual kind of place, but because it was close to the bus stop, and he had a second job that started at 9, and the coffee at the gas station 2 blocks down had been sold out. He had ordered a medium black coffee and handed over his card. The machine had processed for 3 seconds, then displayed a message he did not immediately understand. The bank had flagged his account, not because of any fault of his, but because of a system update that had rolled out overnight and locked a small number of accounts pending identity verification. Jack did not know that yet. He only knew that the card reader was blinking. The cashier looked apologetic, and the line behind him had grown longer. He tried the card again. The machine blinked again. He reached into his jacket pocket for a second card, found it, and handed it to the cashier. While the transaction processed, he turned slightly, not to look at anyone in particular, just the automatic adjustment of a person, aware that they are taking up more time than expected. That was when he registered that the woman directly behind him was watching him with an expression that was not patience. Caroline had watched the second card come out and felt something sharpen inside her. She did not say anything yet, but her jaw set and her fingers tightened around her phone. Ryan, standing 2 steps behind her and slightly to the left, noticed both things. He had been her bodyguard for 3 years, and he had learned to read the small signals before they became large ones. He had also learned that the window between a small signal and a large one where Caroline was concerned was considerably shorter than most people expected. The second card also failed to process immediately. The system was slow catching up to itself. The cashier apologized to Jack in a low voice and said it would just be another moment. Jack nodded and said it was fine. He meant it. He had worked jobs where a moment's patience was the difference between things going right and things going badly wrong, and a slow card reader at a coffee shop did not come close to registering on that scale. Caroline's voice came before Jack had time to put his card back in his pocket. "Seriously," she said. Her voice carried. It was the kind of voice trained to carry clear, precise, used to being heard across a conference table or above a room full of people. "Both cards. You're holding up an entire line because you can't figure out which card actually has money on it." The room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the way a room shifts when something has happened that no one expected and no one is sure how to respond to. Two women at a nearby table looked up from their laptops. The cashier's expression went carefully neutral. Jack did not turn around immediately. Caroline continued, and her voice did not drop. "There are people here who actually have somewhere to be. If you can't cover a $9 coffee, maybe this isn't the right place for you." The words landed the way they were meant to, hard, specific, and in front of an audience. There was nothing ambiguous about them. She was not venting to herself or making a quiet remark to Ryan. She was saying it so that Jack could hear it, so that the room could hear it, so that the situation would resolve itself faster because the social pressure would push it toward resolution. That was how Caroline processed inconvenience as a problem to be solved by the application of sufficient force. Jack turned around. He looked at her without anger, which was the thing that most people in the room registered first. His expression was level steady in the way that people are steady when they have absorbed a great deal over a long period of time, and have learned that reacting quickly rarely improves anything. He was taller than Caroline had registered from behind, and his eyes, which were a pale, flat gray, held hers without flinching. "The bank flagged my account," he said. His voice was quiet but not small. "It's a system issue, nothing to do with the balance." "That's what people say," Caroline replied. She did not look away either. The cashier intervened with visible discomfort, explaining that the machine had been running slow all morning, that it was a known issue, that it had nothing to do with the card itself. Caroline did not respond to the cashier. She was already looking at her phone again. The conversation closed as far as she was concerned. Jack's second card finally processed, the receipt printed. He took his coffee from the end of the counter, said thank you to the cashier, and turned to leave. He did not look at Caroline again. The interaction for him was already categorized, alongside the other minor indignities that showed up in a life lived without much financial cushion, not worth carrying, not worth revisiting. He had learned a long time ago that some things were better let go. He was almost at the door when his coffee slipped. Not dramatically, no grand stumble, no loud crash. The cardboard sleeve had been damp from condensation, and his grip, which was tired from hours of warehouse work, didn't catch it in time. The cup hit the floor, and the lid came off, and the coffee spread across the tile in a wide, dark arc. The room watched. Jack crouched down and began picking up the pieces, the cup, the lid, the cardboard sleeve, with the automatic efficiency of someone who had cleaned up messes before without making a production of it. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look at anyone. He simply dealt with what was in front of him the way he dealt with most things. And that quality, that complete absence of performance, was itself something that several people in the room would later mention when they described what they had witnessed that morning. His jacket sleeve pulled back as he reached for the cup, and that was when Ryan saw it. The scar ran from just below Jack's wrist to the midpoint of his forearm. It was not a neat scar. It was thick and irregular, the kind that came from something serious, a crush injury, a burn, a structural failure of some kind. Ryan had seen scars like that before. He had seen exactly that kind of scar before, in a specific context, in a specific place, at a specific point in his life, that he had never fully left behind, even after he'd changed careers and moved on. He had been part of a specialized rescue team for 11 years before he left to work private security. In that time, he had responded to fires, collapses, vehicle accidents, and industrial disasters. One of them, a factory collapse in a manufacturing district on the eastern edge of the city almost 12 years ago, had stayed with him longer than the others. Not because of the scale of it, though the scale had been significant. Because of one person who had been there when Ryan's team arrived. A man who had already gotten most of the trapped workers out before the second section of the building came down. A man who had gone back in a second time and taken a beam across his arm doing it. Ryan had not known the man's name then. His team had documented the survivors and casualties, and the man had refused medical attention for longer than he should have, and then disappeared into the processing of a very chaotic scene before Ryan had a chance to follow up. He had thought about that man occasionally over the years, not with any particular urgency, just the way you think about things that don't fit neatly into the story you've told yourself about how the world works. The man had not waited for instructions or authorization. He had simply looked at the situation and done what the situation required, and then he had walked away from it, without appearing to want anything in return. That was the part Ryan had never quite been able to file away cleanly. The scar on Jack's forearm was on the same arm, in the same position, with the same shape as the one Ryan had seen on the man who went back into that building. Ryan did not move. He stood with his hand near Caroline's elbow, which was his default position, and he did not say anything, and the expression on his face shifted in a way that Caroline did not notice, because she was already looking at the door, already calculating how many minutes she had left before she needed to be in the car. Jack finished picking up the pieces of his broken cup, deposited them in the trash near the door, and looked back once, not at Caroline, but at the cashier. "Sorry about the mess," he said. Then he pushed the door open and walked out into the gray morning air without his coffee, without looking back and without any apparent awareness that the man standing near the register was watching him go with an expression that had moved well past recognition and into something closer to disbelief. Ryan watched the door close behind Jack. Then he looked at Caroline, who was placing her order with the focused efficiency of someone already on to the next task. He said nothing. He filed the information away the way he had been trained to do with things that needed to be verified before they were acted on. But his hands, which were usually very still, were not entirely still anymore. And when he followed Caroline out to the car 7 minutes later, he sat in the front seat and did not make conversation, which Caroline did not notice because she was on a call, and the city moved past the windows, and somewhere out on the street, a man with a scarred forearm was walking toward a bus stop, with no coffee and no particular expression on his face, as if the morning had gone exactly as expected. Back inside Meridian, at a corner table near the window, a young woman had her phone out. She had been filming since Caroline's voice first cut across the room. The video was 43 seconds long. It showed everything clearly: the words, the tone, the audience, and Jack's quiet response. She uploaded it before Caroline's car had reached the end of the block. By the time Caroline walked into her 9 o'clock meeting and shook hands with 3 senior partners who had flown in from out of state, the video had been viewed 11,000 times. She did not know that yet. She was focused on the meeting. Margins existed to be controlled. She was very good at that, until she wasn't. The meeting ran until 11:30. Caroline walked out of the conference room with a signed letter of intent and the particular satisfaction of a person who had executed exactly what they came to do. The 3 partners had been cautious at first, the way people are cautious when they are about to commit a significant amount of money to something. But by the second hour, she had moved them past caution and into certainty, which was where she needed them. She rode the elevator down to the lobby with her phone already out, already moving to the next item. Ryan was waiting near the building entrance. He had the car ready and the door open before she reached the glass doors, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the way he was standing slightly forward. Weight shifted the posture of someone holding something they needed to say. In 3 years, Caroline had learned to read that posture. It meant the information was not small. "There's a video," he said as she reached him. Caroline got into the car. "Of what?" Ryan got in on the other side and pulled up his phone. He handed it to her without explanation. The video was 43 seconds. She watched it once, handed the phone back, and looked out the window. "Someone filmed it," she said. "It's been shared around 200,000 times in the last 4 hours, Ryan replied. "It's on 3 major platforms. 2 news aggregators have picked it up." Caroline's jaw tightened slightly, but she did not react beyond that. She had navigated press situations before. There was a process, legal reviewed it, communications drafted a response, and the story was given context or allowed to cycle out on its own. She had done this before with things that were objectively more serious than a recorded argument at a coffee shop. She told Ryan to call Marcus in communications and set up a briefing for 2 o'clock. Ryan said he would. Then he said, "I need to talk to you about the man." Before the briefing, Caroline turned to look at him. In 3 years, Ryan Cole had never used that particular tone with her, not urgent, not alarmed, but the tone of someone who had been sitting with information long enough that it had changed shape on them. She recognized it as significant not because of what he said, but because of how carefully he was choosing his words. "The man from the coffee shop," he said. "Jack Sullivan. You know his name. I ran him after we left." Ryan kept his eyes on the road. "I had a reason. The scar." He told her about it then, not quickly, and not with the compressed efficiency he used when briefing her on security matters. He told her about his 11 years on the rescue team, about the kinds of calls that stayed with you after you left the job, and about the factory collapse almost 12 years ago that had stayed with him more than most. He told her about arriving on scene and finding that the situation was already partially resolved, that someone had gotten to the upper floors before his team did, had moved workers toward the exit points, had done the thing that the building's own emergency protocols were supposed to do and had failed to do. He told her about the man his team had seen in the east stairwell, moving in the direction of the remaining workers, when every instinct should have been telling him to move the other way. He told her about the secondary collapse, and about the beam, and about the arm. Caroline listened without interrupting. "When I saw the scar this morning," Ryan continued, "I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain. You can't be certain from a scar, but I couldn't set it aside either. So when we got to the meeting, I used some old contacts to pull the incident file." He had reached out to 2 former colleagues still working in the city's emergency services division, men who trusted him from shared years on difficult calls. The file had taken 40 minutes to surface. What it contained had taken him considerably longer to process. A textile manufacturing facility on the eastern edge of the financial district had partially collapsed during a shift change almost 12 years ago. 31 workers had been inside. 28 had gotten out. 2 had not survived. The official report filed by the facility's operations director credited the evacuation to the building's emergency protocols and the rapid response of the city's rescue teams. What the official report did not include what Ryan had found in the supplementary witness statements attached to the file, but never referenced in the summary, was that the protocols had failed within the first 4 minutes. The alarm system had malfunctioned. The evacuation doors on the east side had been blocked by a storage delivery that should not have been there. The workers on the upper floor had been effectively stranded until a man who had arrived that morning for a routine maintenance call had begun moving them out manually, without equipment, without authorization, and without waiting for anyone to tell him it was his responsibility. That man's name appeared twice in the witness statements. Jack Sullivan, contracted maintenance independent, no formal affiliation with the facility, no emergency training on record, no follow-up contact documented anywhere in the file. Ryan handed his phone to Caroline with the relevant page visible on the screen. She read it. Then she read it again. "Why isn't this in the main report?" she asked. Because someone made sure it wasn't, Ryan said. The facility's operations director at the time, a man named Gerald Pruitt, filed the primary incident summary himself. He was the one who spoke to the press afterward. He was the one who accepted a commendation from the city's safety office 3 months later for the facility's emergency response record. Ryan took the phone back. Pruitt was also the one who recommended the facility to Hayes Global's predecessor company as an acquisition target 6 months after the collapse. The acquisition went through. That facility became the foundation of your family's manufacturing division. The car stopped at a light. Outside, the city moved the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, unaware that anything particular was happening inside a black sedan at an intersection in the financial district. Caroline sat very still. She knew the acquisition Ryan was referencing. She had not been involved in it. She had been in her early 20s when it happened, still in graduate school years, away from stepping into any operational role at Hayes Global. But she knew the story the way you know the foundational stories of any institution you've grown up inside. The manufacturing division had been the engine that funded the company's expansion into its current form. Without it, Hayes Global as it existed today would not exist. The acquisition had been considered a masterstroke by her father, who had been CEO at the time. Gerald Pruitt had been praised publicly for his cooperation and the facility's strong safety record. Pruitt took the credit, Caroline said. It was not a question. The evidence points that way, Ryan said carefully. I'm not in a position to say that definitively, but the witness statements are there, and they name Jack Sullivan, and Gerald Pruitt's incident summary doesn't mention him once. Caroline did not respond immediately. She was processing, which was what she did, when information arrived that did not fit the structure she had already built around a situation. She had walked out of a successful meeting 40 minutes ago with a signed letter of intent and a clear picture of how her day was going to proceed. That picture was now considerably more complicated, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that the complication was not primarily professional. It was personal in a way she did not have immediate language for. By the time she reached the office, the communications briefing that Marcus had assembled was already waiting. She walked into the room, registered the expressions of the 4 people around the table, carefully neutral, which meant they were concerned, and sat down. Marcus Hale had been head of communications for Hayes Global for 6 years. He had managed situations that ranged from routine press misquotes to a sourcing scandal that had very nearly cost the company 2 major retail contracts. He was good at his job, which meant he was good at telling people things they did not want to hear, in language that was precise enough to be useful and calm enough not to accelerate the problem. The video is accelerating, Marcus said. He turned his laptop so Caroline could see the metrics. The view count had crossed 1 million. The comment sections across platforms were running in one direction, not divided, not ambiguous, but unified in a way that public sentiment rarely was. The phrase appearing most consistently was class contempt. A journalist from a national business publication had posted a thread calling the incident emblematic of executive culture's disconnect from working-class Americans. 2 of Hayes Global's institutional investors had already contacted the board chair directly. The investors reached out to the chair, Caroline asked. As of this morning, yes, both of them. Caroline looked at the screen for a moment, then looked away. What's the recommended response? Marcus walked her through the draft. A statement expressing regret for any offense caused a note that the situation had been taken out of context, a redirect toward Hayes Global's community investment record. It was the standard architecture of a corporate apology that was not quite an apology designed to satisfy the minimum requirement of public accountability, without conceding anything that could be leveraged later. Marcus had written versions of it before. He was efficient at it. Caroline read the draft. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and did not pick it up again. Who is Gerald Pruitt now? She asked. The question was directed at Ryan, who had come into the room behind her and was standing near the door. Marcus looked between them, unable to track the context. Ryan answered. Retired. Left the manufacturing sector about 8 years ago. He received a civic service award from the city the year after the collapse. There was a brief article. He gave a short speech. And Jack Sullivan. Still in the city, working maintenance and warehouse contracts. No public profile. No press mentions. No record of him ever having said anything publicly about the collapse or his role in it. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the people in them have understood that the conversation has moved somewhere larger than where it started. Marcus looked at Caroline and waited. He had learned in 6 years that the most useful thing he could do in moments like this was give her space without filling it. What Caroline was thinking was this: she had spent the morning in a meeting about the future of her company. She had spent 3 years before that rebuilding Hays Global's public positioning after a difficult period, reframing the narrative around quality and ethics and long-term value. She had given speeches about accountability. She had signed off on a company-wide values charter 18 months ago that used the word integrity 11 times. And somewhere in the foundation of the institution, she had built her identity around. There was a man whose name had been removed from a record he had written with his own body. And she had stood in a coffee shop that morning and told him he did not belong there. She looked at Marcus. "Don't send the statement," she said. Marcus did not visibly react because he was professional. "Caroline, the response window." "I know what the window is," she said. "Don't send it." She stood, took her notes from the table, and left the room. Ryan followed. In the hallway, he fell into step beside her, without being asked which was what he did, when he understood that whatever came next was going to require him nearby. She did not explain where she was going. She did not need to. They had worked together long enough that the direction of travel was readable, even without a destination being named. The video, meanwhile, had reached 1.4 million views. A journalist had tracked down 2 customers from Meridian that morning and quoted them on record. One said it had felt like watching someone get publicly executed for the crime of being poor. A second news outlet had surfaced Ryan's rescue service history through a public records request and noticed his name in the factory collapse report. They had not yet connected that to Jack Sullivan, but they were close, and the distance was narrowing by the hour. Caroline Hays, who had spent 15 years making sure she was always positioned ahead of what was coming, was for the first time in a long time running behind it. The public hearing was announced on a Thursday. It was not a government proceeding, no subpoenas, no legal compulsion, but it carried the weight of one because it had been called by the city's Labor and Workplace Safety Commission in response to what the commission chair described as newly surfaced evidence suggesting material misrepresentation in the official record of a significant industrial incident. The language was careful and bureaucratic, which was the language of institutions that wanted to act without appearing to rush. But the intent was clear. Someone was going to have to account for what had been left out of Gerald Pruitt's incident summary 12 years ago, and the commission intended to find out who knew what and when. The news broke on a Friday morning. By afternoon, 3 television stations had sent crews to the building where Hays Global kept its corporate offices. Marcus managed the lobby and the front entrance, which was what he was good at, and Ryan managed everything else, which was what he was good at. Caroline stayed at her desk and read the commission's formal notice 3 times, then called her legal team and told them to prepare for full cooperation. Her legal team advised caution. That was what legal teams did. They outlined the risk exposure, the potential implications for the acquisition record, the possibility that full cooperation could surface information that complicated Hays Global's historical narrative in ways that were difficult to predict. Caroline listened to all of it and said she understood. Then she told them to prepare for full cooperation anyway, and she said it in the tone that meant the conversation on that particular point was finished. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. In the 4 days between the announcement and the proceeding, the story moved fast. Investigative reporters, who had been loosely following the video story, now had something structural to attach to it: a documented incident, a named individual, a specific set of discrepancies between the official record and the witness statements that Ryan had originally surfaced. 2 of the workers who had been inside the facility the morning of the collapse were located and agreed to speak on record. Both of them named Jack Sullivan without being prompted. One of them was a woman named Dorothy Reeves, who had been working on the upper floor when the alarm failed. She said she had told investigators at the time about the man who had come up the stairs and gotten them moving before anyone in an official capacity arrived. She had assumed it would be in the report. She had never followed up to check, partly because she had been dealing with her own injuries from the collapse, and partly because she had assumed the system would handle it correctly. She said this last part without bitterness, which somehow made it land harder than bitterness would have. The second worker, a man named Thomas Briggs, had been near the east exit when the blocked delivery prevented evacuation. He said Gerald Pruitt had interviewed him personally in the days following the collapse, and that he had told Pruitt everything who had been there, what that person had done, and in what order. He said Pruitt had written it down. He said those notes had apparently gone nowhere. When a reporter asked him how he felt about that, Thomas Briggs said he had felt a lot of things over 12 years and had mostly run out of energy for feeling them, but that he was glad someone was finally asking. Both statements were entered into the public record before the hearing even began. By Monday evening, Gerald Pruitt had issued a statement through a personal attorney, saying that his recollection of events differed from other accounts, and that he looked forward to providing clarification in the appropriate setting. It was the statement of a man who understood that the appropriate setting was no longer in his favor. Jack Sullivan had not spoken publicly. He had not responded to the 3 journalists who had located his phone number or to the commission's initial outreach. Ryan had eventually reached him directly, not through official channels, but through a call he made himself from his personal number on a Tuesday evening while sitting in the parking structure adjacent to Hayes Global's building. He did not tell Caroline he was doing it until after it was done. He told her that night in her office, the building mostly empty around them. He said he had called Jack and explained who he was, not as Caroline's bodyguard, but as someone who had been on the rescue team that day 12 years ago, someone who remembered. He said Jack had listened without interrupting, and at the end had said very little. The thing Jack had said was, "I didn't do it to be on record." Ryan relayed this without editorial comment, but the silence that followed it in the office said enough. Caroline had spent 15 years in a world where everything was done to be on record, every decision documented, every contribution attributed and filed and surfaced at the appropriate moment. The idea of doing something that cost a person the use of their arm and then genuinely, completely not caring whether anyone ever acknowledged it, that was not a concept she had a ready framework for. She sat with it for a while without speaking. She asked Ryan if Jack would appear at the hearing. Ryan said he didn't know. He said Jack had not said no. Jack appeared. He came without a lawyer, without a prepared statement, without anyone accompanying him. He sat at the witness table in a room that held approximately 200 people, commission members, press members of the public, and in the 3rd row on the left side, Caroline Hayes, and he answered questions in the same voice he had used at the coffee shop register a week earlier, quiet, steady, without performance. The commission chair, a woman named Sandra Voss, who had been overseeing labor and workplace matters for the city for 9 years, led the questioning with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the facts in front of her were sufficient and did not need to be dramatized. She walked Jack through the morning of the collapse, what he had been doing at the facility, what he had observed when the alarm failed to activate what he had decided, and why, in what order. Jack answered each question directly. He did not elaborate beyond what was asked, did not frame his answers to cast himself in a particular light, and did not look at anyone in the audience while he was speaking. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, and the scar on his forearm was visible to anyone who looked. When Sandra Voss asked him why he had gone back into the building a second time after getting the first group of workers out, Jack was still for a moment before answering. Then he said, "There were still people in there." He said it as if it were the only reasonable explanation available, which to him it was. Sandra Voss wrote something down. She did not ask a follow-up question. The answer did not require one. Dorothy Reeves testified after Jack. She identified him from across the room without hesitation, pointed directly at him, and said, "That's the man. That's who came up those stairs." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. Thomas Briggs testified after her and confirmed in plain language that he had told Pruitt exactly what he had seen and that Pruitt had recorded it. When asked whether he believed Pruitt had intentionally omitted the information, Briggs said he was not in a position to read minds, but that he had told the man what he witnessed, and the man had chosen what to include in his report. He let that sit without adding anything to it. Gerald Pruitt testified in the afternoon session. He was in his mid-60s, now carrying more weight than the photographs from 12 years ago, and he chose his words with the careful precision of someone who had been extensively coached. He said he had relied on the documented emergency protocols in compiling his incident summary. He said the witness accounts from that day had been numerous and sometimes contradictory. He said he had acted in good faith throughout. He did not say Jack Sullivan's contributions were unimportant. He said only that he had not been able to independently verify every account, given the time constraints of the investigation. Sandra Voss asked him whether he had tried. Pruitt's attorney objected on grounds of relevance. Sandra Voss noted the objection and moved forward with an expression that communicated her assessment of it, clearly enough that no one in the room needed her to say it out loud. By the close of the afternoon session, the commission had enough on the record to issue a formal finding. The finding would take several weeks to finalize, but its direction was not in question. The witness statements were consistent, the gaps in the official record were documented, and two people who had been inside that building had testified under oath in a public proceeding. What had been buried in a supplementary file for 12 years was now the center of the record, in a room with cameras and reporters and 200 people watching. Caroline had not been called to testify. Hayes Global's connection to the facility was historical and indirect. The acquisition had occurred after the incident, and her family's company had played no role in the original investigation or the report. But she had come anyway, and she had sat in the third row for the full day, and when the afternoon session ended, she did not move with the crowd toward the exits. Ryan was beside her. He said nothing which was correct. She watched Jack Sullivan push his chair back from the witness table and stand. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, folded it over his arm, and said something quietly to Sandra Voss. Voss responded, and whatever she said made Jack nod, once the expression of a person receiving something they had not asked for and were not entirely sure what to do with. Then he turned toward the exit. Caroline stood and moved through the row before she had fully decided what she was going to say. Ryan followed at a distance. Jack saw her coming and did not change his expression, but he stopped and weighted jacket over his arm with the stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago not to read a situation before it had finished presenting itself. She stopped in front of him. The room was still moving around them, people leaving, staff collecting documents, a camera crew repositioning near the door. "I was wrong," she said. "In the coffee shop last week, I had no basis for what I said, and I said it anyway. And I made sure it was loud enough to land in front of an audience. That was deliberate, and it was wrong." She did not qualify it or redirect it. She let it stand as what it was. Jack looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I know." Not as a rebuke and not as forgiveness, as a statement of fact, which was how he seemed to handle most things. Caroline said, "Hayes Global is establishing a fund for workers affected by industrial accidents, specifically cases where the official record failed them, where contributions went undocumented or were improperly attributed. Ryan has already identified several existing cases. We're starting there. She said it without the cadence of a press release, without the framing she used in boardrooms. I'm not telling you this because I think it changes what happened. I'm telling you because it's what we're doing. Jack considered it. That's a good thing to do, he said. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was the response of someone who evaluated things on whether they were useful and had concluded that this one was. Caroline accepted it for what it was. She left through the front entrance where the cameras were waiting. Ryan had told Marcus to expect her. She stopped on the steps and made a statement that had not been drafted by communications and had not been reviewed by legal. She said she had treated a man she knew nothing about with open contempt in a public space, and that there was no framing that made that acceptable. She said Hayes Global would cooperate fully with the Commission's review and would audit its own historical acquisition records to ensure that any workers whose contributions had been improperly omitted were formally identified and acknowledged. She said this was not a crisis response. She said it was a correction, and that the correction was long overdue. Marcus stood to her left and slightly behind her. He did not look as though he had anticipated any of this. He did not look displeased. He looked like a man recalibrating in real time, which was also something he was good at. The board convened 2 days later. The conversation about Caroline's position, which had been moving toward a formal review, did not produce the outcome some members had expected. It produced instead a directive to complete the commission cooperation and a mandate to formalize the fund Caroline had announced on the steps. The two institutional investors who had contacted the board chair moved from active pressure back to watchful waiting. It was not a resolution, but it was a change in direction, and a week earlier that change had not existed. Jack Sullivan was back at work the morning after the hearing. His shift started at 5:30, and he was there at 5:20, which was how he operated. He worked a logistics facility in the south part of the city, not far from where the textile factory had stood before. It was demolished sometime in the late 2000s and replaced with a parking structure. He did not think about the hearing while he worked. He thought about what was in front of him, because that was what required thinking about, and the work did not do itself. Mid-morning, he reached up to check a fitting on an upper shelf in the loading bay. His sleeve pulled back. The scar caught the light. A co-worker nearby noticed it and almost said something, then reconsidered, because Jack's expression did not invite the conversation. It was not an unfriendly expression. It was simply the face of a man doing what he came to do, who had already set down everything else: the hearing room, the cameras, the woman who had stopped him on his way out in the place where he kept things that were finished. He completed his shift, signed out, and walked to the bus stop in the late afternoon. The city was gray and indifferent around him, the way it usually was, the way he had come to find reliable rather than discouraging. He stood at the stop with his hands in his jacket pockets and waited with the patience of someone who had learned over a long time, and through things that had cost him considerably, that most things arrived eventually if you were still standing there when they did.